Alright, so we're going to get into reading some Junger. Let's do it. Chapter 1. The Age of the Third Estate as an Age of Illusory Dominion. The dominion of the Third Estate has never, in Germany, been able to touch that innermost core determining the richest of power and fullness of life. Looking back on more than a century of German history, we can confess with pride that we have been bad bourgeois. It was not to our figure that the cloth was cut. Now worn down to the last thread, a wilder and more innocent nature now, appearing in its tatters, it will replace the one whose sentimental tones had shaken the curtains behind which at times concealed the great spectacle of democracy. No, the German was not a good bourgeois. Least of all where he was at his strongest, wherever thought was deepest and boldest, wherever feeling was most alive, wherever the fight was most relentless, the revolt against the values emblazoned on its shield by reason's great Declaration of Independence is unmistakable. Yet never were the bearers of the immediate responsibility described as geniuses more isolated. Never were they more endangered in their actions and achievements than here. And never was the pure development of the hero more meagerly nourished. The roots had to penetrate deep into the barren soil to reach the wellsprings embedding the magical unity of blood and spirit that makes the word irresistible. It was just as difficult for those for the will to achieve the other unity of might and right, which, raising individuality to the rank of law, sets it over those to whom it was alien. That is why this period was overflowing with great hearts, whose final rebellion consisted in holding back their blows, overflowing with elevated spirits for whom the silence of the world of shadows seemed welcome. It was rich in statesmen, for whom the wellsprings of their own times ran dry, and who had to draw on those of the past in order to act for the future, and rich in battles of different kind, in which blood, rather than the spirit, was tested in both victories and defeats. So this is somewhat getting esoteric, and I'm going to add a little bit of my own commentary here, but this is very similar to the United States right now, especially drawing on the past in order to act for the future. This is something that the United States has to do. They have to bring up World War II. They have to bring up, various other, bring it back to 1776 or whichever, right? To justify their rightful place. And to say the least, you could say the Germans were bad bourgeois. The Americans in general are not the greatest bourgeois, but that's a whole other story. This is why all the positions the German was able to occupy during this time brought him no happiness. Rather, they recall in their decisive points those battle flags whose meaning lies in the marching order of still distant armies. Instances of this interior conflict are evident everywhere, because the German could make no use of the freedom offered him with all the arts of the sword and set in the proclamation of universal human rights. This freedom was for him a tool that bore no relation to his innermost organs. Absolutely. And this is the same thing today. The West promotes human rights, promotes this idea of let's be friendly to everybody. It's not something that stirs the soul, is it? It's something that may stir Lib's soul to think that we're going to care about people, and these are the types of folks who would cry at commercials of seeing the dogs for PETA or something like that, or for the American Humane Society, and will cry instead of changing the channel with like most people. But that's me. Maybe that's kind of schizo, but hey, schizo gang, schizo autism gang, baby. Thus, wherever the language began to be spoken in Germany, wherever this language, it was easy to surmise that it was only a consequence of poor translations and the mistrust of a world that was the cradle of the bourgeois ethos was all the more justified because time and again a more primal language sought to make itself heard, whose dangerous and distinctive meaning lay beyond doubt. we nurtured the suspicion that here such precious, such costly valuations were not taken seriously. We suspected that behind its mask lay an incalculable and unbridled force, seeking final refuge in a peculiarly primordial relation, and our suspicions were correct. For in this land it is not possible to establish a concept of freedom applicable like a fixed rule, contentless in itself to any matter we might wish to subject it to. Rather, it has always been the case that the measure of freedom possessed by any force corresponds precisely to the measure of obligation assigned to it, and the extent of a liberated will reveals itself as the extent of the responsibility bestowing on this will legitimacy and validity. So here's my reading of that little bit. Basically, is they attach the idea of human rights to the reason for it, and there's an obligation to take people in from Afghanistan because we owe them. That's what, people like Vosh will say, right? We owe them for all these things that we did. And and the extent of the liberated will reveals itself as the extent of the responsibility bestowing on this will legitimacy and validity. So it's valid to take care of these folks, and we need to bring them in. This is the way it should. Also because they are more willing to trust the system, more so than native-born Americans in some cases. But that's another story. This is expressed in, This is expressed in such a way that nothing else bearing the seal of this responsibility can enter into our reality, hence into our history in its highest fateful meaning. About this seal nothing need be said, because it is conferred immediately. Signs are carved into it that a willing obedience can immediately decipher. Thus, our freedom reveals itself most powerfully whenever born by the consciousness of itself as an enfeoffment. This consciousness has been expressed in all those unforgettable pronouncements with which the nation's oldest aristocracy covers the people's coat of arms. It governs thinking and feeling, deed and work, statesmanship and religion. Therefore, the world is shaken to its very foundations each time the German recognizes what freedom, that is, when he recognizes what necessity is. Here, nothing can be conceded, and even if the world came to an end, the commandment must nonetheless be carried out when the call is heard. A trait considered above all others is the hallmark of the German, namely order. Will always be undervalued if we cannot recognize in it the steely reflection of freedom. Obedience is the art of listening in order, readiness for the word, readiness for the command, traveling like lightning from the top to the roots. Everyone and everything stands in this feudal order, and the leader is recognized as such because he is the first servant, the first soldier, the first worker. Both freedom and the worker and freedom and order relate, therefore, not to society, but to the state. And the model of each structure is the structure of an army, and not the social contract. This is why we are at our strongest when there is no doubt about leadership and allegiance. This must be recognized, that dominion and service are one and the same. The age of the Third Estate never recognized the miraculous power of this unity, because it sought pleasures that we were all too cheap and too human. Thus, all the points the German was able to reach in this age were reached. Despite this, in all fields, the movement took place in an alien and unnatural element. The real ground could only be accessed, as it were, wearing diving helmets. The decisive work was carried out in mortal space. Honor the fallen who were shattered by the dreadful isolation of love or knowledge, or cut down by the sword on the smoldering hills of battle. But there is no going back. Those in Germany who today look to a new dominion turn their gaze to wherever they glimpse a new awareness of freedom and responsibility in work. So it should be said here, I'm going to add in some more commentary. This book came out in 1932, just before Hitler's ascension to power in 1933. So I'm going to see if there's some allusions in here to that. And I definitely do see that, where the leader is, a servant of the people, this and that. Very much a lot of stuff that, Hitler would talk about. It's basically the Führer principle. At least in my view. I know people are going to be like, that's not specifically what it is, but okay. Let us first seek out this consciousness. Oh, excuse me. This is the second chapter, The Worker Reflected in the Mirror of the Bourgeois World. Let us first seek out this consciousness where it is hardest at work, but let us seek it out with love, with the will to interpret thoroughly what we actually find. Let us therefore turn toward the worker, who early on invoked a relentless opposition to all bourgeois values, and drew the strength for his movements from the sense of this opposition. We stand sufficiently far from the beginning of these movements to do them justice. No one can choose for himself the school bench on which his character is formed, because schools are chosen by fathers. But the day comes when we sense we have outgrown it, and we recognize our true vocation. We must consider this when thinking about the power of the workers' means, and we should remember that they were forged in battle, and in battle every position is taken up in response to the enemy. It would be all too easy to complain that the worker's substance, like a metal, yet to be melted into purity, is shot through with bourgeois values, and its language, unquestionably of the 20th century, is full of concepts shaped by 19th century questions. For he needed to use these concepts to make himself understood when he first began to speak, and the confines of his demands were determined by the demands of his opponent. Thus, slowly he came up against the bourgeois ceiling, finally bursting through it, and it is hardly surprising that he bears the marks of this development. However, these marks were left not only by what held him back, but also what nourished him. We saw that in Germany for good reasons. The Third Estate was incapable of achieving an open, recognized dominion. Thus, the worker had the strange ancillary task of providing this dominion. It is a very significant act that he first had to bring the alien element mixed in with his endeavors under this dominion, in order to discover that it was not his own. These, as we said, are the residues of nourishment, and the elimination of waste will remove them. Yet, how could it have been otherwise, since the first teachers of the worker were bourgeois in origin, and the systems the youthful force was embedded in were bourgeois systems? This explains how the memory of the bloody marriage of the bourgeoisie with power, the memory of the French Revolution, was the wellspring that fed and directed the workers' first stirrings. But there are no repetitions of the historical process, then there are the transfers of its living contents. So it turned out, whenever someone intended to perform a revolutionary work in Germany, it was a mere playing at revolution, while the actual upheavals took place out of sight, perhaps in quiet places or veiled under the smoldering curtains of battle. But the truly novel does not need the overemphasis it finds in revolt, since its greatest danger resides in the simple act of its presence. The identification of the sphere of the worker with a fourth estate arises, first of all, from a lack of clear vision. Only an intelligence habituated to thinking in mechanical images can picture the procession of successive dominions such that, just as the hand of the clock casts its shadow over the hours, one estate after the other passes through the frame of power, while below a new class is already awakening to consciousness. Rather, only the bourgeoisie has seen itself as an estate in this particular sense. It has cut this word of a very old and noble provenance loose from its natural concepts, stripped it of its meaning, and made it into nothing other than a mask for its interests. It is a bourgeois way of looking to see workers as an estate, and what lies behind this interpretation is an unconscious cunning seeking to fit the new demands in an old frame, designed to enable the conversation to continue. For wherever the bourgeois is able to converse, wherever he is able to bargain, is where he feels safe. The uprising of the workers will not, however, be a secondary and pale rehash prepared from outdated recipes. The essential difference between the bourgeois and the worker lies not in the temporal succession of dominions, not in the opposition between old and new. The fact that dull interests are replaced by younger and more brutal ones is too self-evident to waste time thinking about. Moreover, what commands our highest attention is the fact that between the bourgeois and the worker, there is not only a difference in age, but above all a difference in rank. For the worker stands in a relation to the elemental powers of whose mere presence the bourgeois never had an inkling. This is to do, as we shall explain, with how the worker, on the basis of his own being, is capable of freedom completely different from bourgeois freedom, and his demands which he holds in readiness are far more comprehensive, far more significant, far more redoubtable than those of an estate. Secondly, any attack, any front that confines the worker to a combat position limited to an attack on society can only be regarded as a provisional front, merely one of initial vanguard skirmishes. For this word, too, has been sharply devalued in a bourgeois age. It has acquired a particular meaning whose sense in the negation of the state as the highest instrument of power. What lies at the heart of this endeavor is the need for security, and thus arises the attempt to deny the existence of danger, to seal off the space required for life, to prevent it from breaking in. Granted, danger is always present, and triumphs even over the subtlest subterfuges which it is ensnared. Indeed, it seeps unpredictably into the subterfuges to conceal itself within them. This lends civilization its duplicitous face. The close connections that exist between fraternity and scaffold, between human rights and murderous battles, are all too familiar. Yet it would be wrong to assume that the bourgeois, even at his best, would ever have conjured up single-handedly the specter of danger. Rather, it all seems more like the terrible, scornful laughter of nature at its subordination to morality. A furious exultation of blood over spirit when the prologue of fine speeches comes to an end. Hence, any relationship between society and the elemental is denied. Indeed, with an investment that remains incomprehensible to anyone who does not discern a most secret ideal as the source of its thoughts. This denial relegates the elemental to the realm of error or dreams, or a necessary evil will, indeed in a way that assumes it to be synonymous with nonsense itself. The accusation of stupidity and immorality is crucial here, and since society defines itself through the two highest concepts of reason and morality, this accusation represents the means by which one banishes the adversary from the space of society, from the space of humanity, and thereby from the space of the law. This distinction corresponds to a process we have time and again observed with astonishment, namely, that precisely at the bloodiest peaks of civil war, society declares the abolition of the death penalty, as if on cue, and always comes up with its best ideas about the immorality and senselessness of war, when its battles are covered up with corpses. To assume there was a purpose behind this most particular dialectic, however, would be to overestimate the bourgeois. This is something that I think a lot of this is saying. This is kind of like what conspiracy theory is based on, right? Where it's like they have an evil plan for us, and in reality, you find that you're giving too much credit to the bourgeois, you're giving more credit to these folks than they deserve. I think that's what he's trying to say here. So, at least that's my interpretation of it. You may feel differently, and if you do, that's perfectly okay. But anywho, would be to overrate the bourgeois, because in no other areas does he take himself more seriously than reason and morality. Indeed, in his most significant manifestations, he is the very union of the rational with the moral. The elemental forces itself upon him from a sphere quite different from that of his own strength, and he recognizes with horror the point at which bargaining is at an end. He would delight himself forever with his fine accusations, constructed on the cornerstones of virtue and justice, were it not for the mob bringing him, at the right moment, the unexpected gift of its more powerful but formless strength, drawing its sustenance from the primordial forces of the swamp. Forever would he manage to hold in abeyance the balance of powers like a work of art existing for its own sake, were it not for the occasional appearance of the warrior above him, whom he is always reluctantly yet constantly ready to allow to do as he pleases. He declines responsibility, though, because he recognizes freedom not in its character and particularity, but in its genetic morality. There is no better example of this than the way he eliminates, as soon as the task is done, the very perpetrator and assassin who first blew open from the gates to dominion. The incarceration of passions is the official confirmation with which he guarantees the spoils of revolutions, and the hanging of the hangman is the satyr play that concludes the tragedy of the uprising. The bourgeois also rejects the highest justification for war, the attack, because he probably feels that he is not up to it, and when he calls on soldiers for assistance or disguises himself as a soldier, albeit out of the most obvious self-interest, he will never be able to do so without swearing that it is only in self-defense, and as far as possible in the defense of humanity. Now, there's a lot to be said about this with politicians in general, but I think this could be, I'm going to say this, I think this could be a slight towards Hitler already, or disguises himself as a soldier, saying that Ernst Junger was the actual soldier and Hitler being the Bohemian corporal. This is something that was used by the conservative movement a lot. So I feel like this is a slight, and that's fine. Like I say, it is what it is. This is a book, will past, what is it? We're talking 90-something years ago now. But, I take it all with a grain of salt. Probably, let me think. Is it 79 years? I'm trying to think about the math here. 9, carry the 1. 3. I think it's like 89 years ago. So I take this all with a grain of salt, but still, very relevant nonetheless. The bourgeois knows only the defensive war, so he does not know war at all, because his very nature excludes him from all warlike elements. On the other hand, he is unable to prevent the eruption into his orders, because all the valuations he can set against them are of a lower rank. Here begins the artful interplay of his concepts and his politics. Indeed, the universe itself is for him a mirror in which he wishes to see his virtue confirmed again and again. It would be instructive to observe him as he tirelessly chisels away at a word, gradually wearing away its essential features until a universally applicable morality emerges, to observe how he sees a conquest of a colony as its peaceful exploration, the annexation of a province as the right of self-determination of the people, or the plundering of the defeated as a reparation. But it is enough to know the method to guess the conception of this dictionary began with the equation of society with the state. Everyone who has grasped the will to grasp the great anger, namely that the worker has been covertly robbed of his demands by being given to understand society as his supreme target of attack. The decisive attack orders still orders still exhibit all the characteristics of an age in which it was just as self-evident that an awakening power had to recognize itself as an estate, as it was self-evident that a successful seizure of power had to be characterized as a mere change in the social contract. But it is important to consider this. Society is not a form in itself, but only one of the basic forms of the bourgeois imagination. This is demonstrated when there is no dimension in the bourgeois politics not understood as society. Society is a total population of the globe presenting itself as the concept of an individual image of a unified humanity whose division into states, nations, or races is in the end based on nothing other than an error of thinking. This error in thinking, however, will be corrected over time through treatises, through education, through civilization, or simply through the progress of means of transportation. Society is the state, whose essence becomes distorted to the same degree to which society subordinates itself to its own measures. This attack takes place through the concept of civil liberty, whose task is the transformation of all bonds of responsibility into revocable contractual relationships. In the closest relationship to society stands, finally, the individual, that strange and abstract figure of man, most precious discovery of bourgeois sensibility, and at the same time the inexhaustible object of its artistic creativity. Just as humanity is the cosmos of this conception, so is man its atom. Practically, however, the individual sees himself in contrast not with humanity, but with the mass, his exact mirror image in this supremely strange and supremely imaginary world. Because the mass and the individual are one, and from this unity results the astonishing double image of the most colorful, most confusing anarchy, as well as of the plain procedures of democracy, a spectacle that has been played out for a century. However, it is done. It is one of the hallmarks of a new era that in bourgeois society it is condemned to death, regardless of whether its concept of freedom is represented in the mass or in the individual. The first step consists in no longer thinking and feeling through these forms, and the second in no longer acting through them. This means nothing less than an attack on everything that makes life dear for the bourgeois. It is thus a vital issue for the bourgeois to ensure that the worker sees himself simply as a future carrier of society. For if this remains a dogmatic datum, then the basic form of the bourgeois view is preserved and the finest possibility of his dominion secured. So give me just a moment there. Yeah, once you no longer see yourself as part of, this larger society and not, being part of a mass, then, things are easier. Of course, I'm still very, very, very far away from that, but, I'm kind of getting to a point where I can break away from that, almost. No wonder, then, that society, not just in its appearance, but far more effectively in its principles, is embedded in all regulations prescribed by the bourgeois spirit to the worker, from its professional chairs and lofty chambers. Society renews itself by means of simulated attacks on itself. Its indefinite character, or rather characterlessness, means it is also able to absorb within itself its sharpest self-negation. Its means of doing this are twofold. Either it attributes this negation to its individually anarchic pole and incorporates it into its existence by subordinating it to its own concept of freedom, or it traps negation within itself at the apparently opposite pole of the mass, transforming it there through counting, voting, negotiation, or debate into a democratic act. Its feminine disposition betrays itself when society seeks not to distance itself from contradictions, but to absorb them. Wherever it encounters a demand that can be seen as decisive, its cleverest ruse is declared an expression of its concept of freedom, thus legitimizing it before the form of its constitution, that is, rendering it harmless, aka co-opting. It is this process that supplied the word radical with its insufferable bourgeois aftertaste, incidentally making radicalism itself into a lucrative business. Yeah, bringing up people like Hassan Piker. It is a lucrative business to be a radical. From which one generation after another of politicians and artists drew their only sustenance. This is the last refuge of stupidity, insolence, and hopeless ineptitude playing con tricks by dressing itself up in the ethos of radicalism. So there we go. That pretty well describes people like Vosh, Hassan Piker, and other folks that make money by calling themselves radicals. They may not specifically call themselves that. They'll be like, oh, I'm not really a radical, but that's what they are. This is what it is. Very, very, like I say, well done. Ernst Junger predicted breadtube. There you have it. Too long, far too long, has the German been part of this unworthy spectacle. His only excuse is his belief that every form must necessarily include some content, and the only consolation is that although this spectacle is indeed taking place in Germany, it by no means takes place within German reality. This all sinks into the realm of oblivion, not the oblivion that resembles the ivy covering the ruins and the graves of the fallen, but another terrible oblivion which unmasks this mendacity and unreality, dispersing it without a trace or consequence. It must be left to a later specific study to uncover. Let me see here. Sorry. Okay, yeah, sorry. To uncover the extent to which bourgeois thinking succeeded in falsifying the image of society by feigning itself, its self-negation, its first exertions of the worker. One would discover the worker's freedom as a retracting of the pattern of bourgeois freedom in this thinking, in which fate is, from now on, completely openly interpreted as a contractual relation subject to termination. And one of the greatest triumphs of life is seen as an amendment of the current contract. Actually, you know what? Let me go ahead and do this right now while I'm thinking about it. Let me go ahead about, yeah. It is this process supplied the word radical. Stupidity, insolence, and hopeless ineptitude. That's brilliant. I love that. I'm just going to let the music play for a moment. Okay. Okay, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and skip down a little bit because we're going to finish this up fairly soon. Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and just stop it right here for now because I think we've reached a kind of an impasse. We got through 13 pages. Kind of unlucky, but so stick around. We're going to continue to read some more here from that point, and we're going to go from there. So I hope y'all enjoyed part 1 of this, and I'm gonna try to have a little more stamina, and we're gonna go for at least another 7 minutes next time, or at least another 40 minutes next time. So hopefully y'all enjoy that. See you later. Goodbye.